Morning. It's been referenced already, so let me clarify and expound. A couple weeks ago, I was playing basketball, as I have been doing for the past several decades, and I tore my Achilles. I had the surgery the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and so I am in a cast now. But when Bishop Starsky Wilson calls, you get your knee stroller, and you let the church roll on. So grateful and thankful to him for being here. Salute to my dear sister, Reverend Tracy Blackman, who is here. Honored to be with Reverend Wallis and this wonderful panel, and with all of you, men and women of God, brothers and sisters in the struggle. Let me start by saying how unfair and rather ungodly it is to have to respond to Reverend Jim Wallis's book in less than 15 minutes. Let me also announce that it is very dangerous to give a black Baptist preacher a time limit. But in an attempt to do justice, I'll simply respond to some of Reverend Wallis's foundational claims and central arguments that are made in the book that captivate me and on some levels arrest me as a black servant scholar pastor. Many of you should know that 2019 marks 400 years since enslaved Africans were brought to North America via the transatlantic slave trade. Some researchers and self-made scholars have sought to claim that those enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas on a slave ship named Jesus. They are only partly right. Jesus of Lubeck was indeed an actual slave ship. It was commonly referred to as the good ship Jesus, go figure. However, that ship actually set sail several decades before the first enslaved Africans arrived at Jamestown, Virginia. Now, I bring this up this morning to describe the rhetorical relationship between white supremacy, the American slaveocracy, and the religious conceptuality of Jesus. Since Jesus arrived in America, he has been associated and mostly aligned with the oppression of black bodies and the exploitation of black labor. For black folks, Jesus and America has always been a site of crisis. Cornel West once said September 11th was the first time many Americans felt unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. But to be black in America for the past 400 years is to be at all times unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. Dr. West's articulation of this perpetual crisis for black folks in this country actually honored and welcomed some latecomers to the party. Reverend Wallis deals with this critical quagmire throughout his book by righteously redressing the relationship between race and religion. We just seen him doing some of that here this morning. My inference at this particular point is that the ideological and tangible influence of Christ and Christianity in this country has been in a state of crisis for black folks ever since we were forced into hush harbors, which gave birth to black churches, African American spirituality, and the slave revolts that sustained us. To that end, I'm somewhat inclined to reject the idea that the Christianity we need to produce, embrace, promote, or practice can actually be reclaimed. The Jesus of America, or maybe I should say the American Jesus, has always been the conduit for slave theology and plantation prosperity. We see clearly in the foundations of this country what happened through Ibram X. Kendi's seminal text, Stamped from the Beginning, which details the theological conflictions of, among other people, Thomas Jefferson. The American Jesus that has become commonplace in our social, political, religious psychology is, as Reverend Wallis points out, a whitewashed and blasphemous version of what I believe to be the radical and revolutionary liberator, a northeastern Afro-Asiatic black man who was born to a single-parent mother who got pregnant before she got married, and people weren't certain who the baby's father was. Now, I don't know if you caught it like I pitched it, but that sounds a whole lot more like Tupac Shakur than Donald Trump. But this is the historical reality of Jesus that has provided us with inspired interpretive tension and prophetic potential laid out in works like Cameron Carter's Race, a Theological Account, Edward Bloom and Paul Harvey's The Contested Colors of Christ, Kelly Brown Douglas's The Black Christ, and one of my favorites, Reverend Albert Clegg Jr.'s The Black Messiah. Reverend Wallis's book can be a companion to these types of work because of his courageous investigation of how the historical and biblical Jesus has been defaced and defamed by a white evangelical theology that's so closely aligned to white supremacy we could hardly ever tell them apart. What Reverend Wallis has sparked for me most provocatively, not just in this particular book, but within his broader legacy of writing, work, and public witness, is a more intentional engagement with religion, politics, and power. In other words, he has challenged us to be more lucid in our interrogation of who Jesus is, not just who Jesus was, and how well we practice what Jesus preached. What Peter Gomes called the scandalous gospel of Jesus Christ. Reverend Wallis helps us clarify and lean into political theology, this innate relationship between theology and politics, and I think this is critical and crucial because too many of us have been deceived by the mythical separation of church and state. And that's despite President Bush's claim that God told him to invade a country with no weapons of mass destruction. And President Obama, a self-proclaimed Christian with a kill list, was lambasted at the mythical perception of being Muslim and still had to denounce his radical black pastor, Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, because Reverend Wright was way too unashamedly black and unapologetically Christian. Go figure. These are just two instances that come to mind that trump, pun intended, the idea that religion is compartmental or a private matter in this country. Reverend Wallis's book, much like his work, God's Politics, reminds me that all theology is political because it is ultimately concerned with power. Therefore, any theology that does not take into account our concrete social and political realities is an irrelevant and irreverent theology. I believe Reverend Wallis hones in on this idea most readily in chapter 3 of the book, the chapter called The Image Question. And I'll pivot here because our ideological, philosophical, and rhetorical construction of the image of God, the imago Dei that he was talking about, is foundational when understanding who our neighbors are, what truth is, what makes us afraid, how we deal with corrupt political power, and other themes that Wallis renders throughout the book's spiritual sojourn, pun intended. And since he was remixing stuff earlier from Gandhi, let me remix what Wallis said in this 3rd chapter, because I contend that our theology impacts our anthropology and influences our sociology. Theology is how we see God, anthropology is how we see our neighbor, and sociology is how we see our neighborhood. And if we have a slavish or white supremacy adjacent view of God, we'll make it legally justifiable to enslave our neighbor and absolutely fine to force folks to live in a 21st century plantation. Our imaging of God creates opportunities for us to see the way God requires us to show up in the world today. The images we produce and promote help us to shape a psychology of not only how the world is, but how the world ought to be. So I was led to think about some historical exercises in reimagining God and the theological and political implications that are associated with them. Reverend Wallis can speak to this because while he was in Detroit, he probably heard about what happened on Resurrection Sunday in 1967 at what was formerly known as Central United Church of Christ. Reverend Albert Clegg Jr. unveiled a mural of the Black Madonna and Child in the sanctuary, which revised and revisioned the church to become what we now know as the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Now, can we imagine what that image did to the social, spiritual, and political psychology of those parishioners? And in that same spirit, allow me to offer the recommendation made by one Reverend Laura Mayo, senior minister of Covenant Church in Houston, Texas, who's a white sister, by the way, who mused, quote, what if white Christians had a more realistic image of Jesus, a dark-skinned religious minority refugee, end quote. These are the questions I'm using and asking. What if every white church committed to the liberation struggle, or at least who say we're committed to the liberation struggle, recognized the need to shift the spiritual, social, and political psychology of its parishioners and erected an image of black Jesus in their sanctuaries? Don't worry, I'll wait. Wow. Reverend Blackman, can you imagine the conversations that will be sparked, especially amongst young children? Dr. Krause, can you imagine how this might make black parishioners feel who attend white churches to help them with their diversity and multicultural issues? I shared Reverend Mayo's article on my Facebook thread Friday. Reverend Christopher Michael Jones of New Jersey said, quote, many would more likely leave the Christian faith altogether, at least their version of what they ascribe to be the Christian faith. And my response to him was, well, that's exactly what we need. Because their version is white supremacist evangelical theology, which is blasphemous when compared to the Jesus of Nazareth movement. Another pastor jumped on and said, they probably just bleached Jesus. And a sister scholar said, quote, it would cause the same kind of dialectical tensions and cognitive dissonance that we see with men and the subject of religious headship and societal leadership based in an essentialist paradigm. Man, I wish I had wrote that. But maybe we need more tension and more dissonance. Maybe the answer is not shying away from the crisis, but instead of reacting to the crisis, embracing and revolutionizing the crisis. All right. Archbishop Oscar Romero argues, quote, a church that does not provoke any crisis, preach a gospel that does not unsettle, proclaim a word of God that does not get under anyone's skin, or a word of God that does not touch the real sin of society in which it is being proclaimed. What kind of gospel is that? You familiar with the call-response tradition of the black church, huh? Amen. I know, right? I'm going to take you to Abyssinia and put you in the amen corner. Teach them how to respond. Preach it, preach it. Let me wrap up by saying it this way. I believe we got to move beyond the symbolic into the structural. We have to advance from mere conversation to moral and militant transformation. Stokely Carmichael said, it's not my responsibility to transform the soul of a racist thug. I'll simply settle for a change in his behavior. And this change can only happen when our image of God is revolutionized in a way that moves us to intentionally politically empower those who have been rendered powerless. This happened for me most critically in November of 2016. I know y'all feel differently, but the result of the past presidential election left a sour taste in my mouth. So I had to peel back some layers, do some self-reflection on how all of this happened. And despite the interference and the collusion and other critical factors, the bottom line that conflicted me the most was how voter turnout was so low. And so I looked at where it was the lowest in Memphis, not just in 2016, but in the past several elections over the past 10 or 15 years, trying to find a pattern, because we have an increase in poverty and disinvestment in the black neighborhoods in a city that's 65% black. And I discovered that the precincts that had the lowest turnout were mega black churches. I realized that we don't have a voter registration problem. We have a voter education problem, a voter engagement problem, and a voter turnout problem. Now, we also have a voter suppression problem. Look, I'm on public record. Y'all know about the lawsuits in Tennessee. Just Google it. But I don't even have enough time to talk about that because y'all only gave a black Baptist preacher 15 minutes to respond, Joseph. No, I'm teasing, sister. I'm teasing, Reverend. But I wondered how we had disconnected the shouting, singing, dancing, and preaching that happens at these hubs of black dignity on Sundays from the need to organize for political power on Super Tuesdays. And from that point, I just vowed to put my faith into political action because the lives of disempowered people made in the image of God who sit in many of our sanctuaries every Sunday depends on it. I realized we didn't need another revival or prayer breakfast or Sunday school class or worship retreat or pulpit swap. We need to organize our people for political power like Jesus did. As Reverend Wallis was talking about, and let me just lean in. That's what got him killed. He wasn't killed for handing out flyers and singing Kumbaya and we shall overcome. Nor was he killed for trying to save Herod and Pilate's soul and get their followers to cross over by being moderate and focusing on his electability. Jesus was killed, executed by the state, because he had the audacity to inspire and organize oppressed people and convince them that they possessed the divine power within them that the seal of the Roman government could not conquer. What if that was the litmus test today? So I just came to grips with the fact that it would not matter how many members were in our churches if we did not have any political control over the policies that impact the lives of our parishioners. So in November of 2017, I organized Up the Vote 901. You heard about it earlier when Reverend Starsky was introducing me. This is a nonpartisan collaborative that's committed to giving more political power, information, and representation to more people and increasing voter turnout in Memphis and Shelby County in every election. And despite establishment subversion, being demonized by the mayor, ostracized by white and black clergy, and scrutinized by some of the same people we're aiming to help, we trained pastors to canvass their congregations for increased voter engagement. We helped increase voter turnout in 3 of the 4 elections we've had since 2016. We conducted a survey of over 2,200 people discussing issues that matter to them. We drafted a people's agenda that was the foundation for the first Memphis People's Convention since 1991, where over 600 people came to vet candidates, and we've ushered in a more potentially progressive slate of candidates with a group of people more engaged and empowered to hold them accountable. But be clear, this is a ministerial calling for me. I don't have the option to engage otherwise. My theology is political and intentional because some of us don't have the luxury of presuming we could just pray our problems away. We have to be willing to be moral and militant. We must be willing to disturb, disrupt, and deliver. So we're going to have to write, fight, march, mentor, preach, teach, organize, mobilize, and whatever else this moment calls for to make justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. God is calling us to face this crisis head on and understand that some of us have never had the luxury of doing anything other than that. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take our time, our talent, and our treasure. And I'm grateful to Reverend Wallis, who has reminded me that there are at least some white brothers and sisters who are willing to fight this good fight with us. Thank you.